What I aim to do today is to highlight the critical contributions of Caribbean theorists to understandings of cultural heritage, while also walking you through the Belizean Dance Club as a locus for the lively, playful, and joyful creation of inclusive culture. To begin, as the international arbiter of culture, UNESCO privileges certain practices and discounts others through its restrictive definition of intangible cultural heritage, ICH. UNESCO's ICH is rooted in a localized community, is transmitted across generations, is reproduced faithfully, is transmitted largely orally, and thereby strengthens the local community. We could call this the rooted model of cultural heritage. Excluded from UNESCO's ICH are cultural activities that are translocal, experimental, improvisational, self-consciously hybrid, transmitted through electronic media, and those that forge and sustain broader, inclusive identities. In their discussions of Creolization, Caribbean theorists Edouard Glissant and Stuart Hall provide an alternative way of thinking about cultural heritage that is less restrictive, that acknowledges that social identities are shifting and contingent, and that acknowledges ongoing cultural creativity, and that can create and fortify new and emergent social networks. Not simply additive, Creolization creates new products and sustains inclusive identities. While 77% of Belizeans identify as of mixed ancestry, Belize's National Institute of Culture and History essentially follows the UNESCO model by focusing on preserving the cultural heritage of distinctive ethnic groups in localized spaces, what it calls Belize's rich tapestry. Cultural activities that are self-consciously modern, improvisational, mediated electronically, and that broaden notions of community do not receive the same official support. On any given weekend night, however, young people gather in dance clubs, which feature musical and dance genres that are self-consciously hybrid, experimental, playful, and translocal, including punta rock, reggaeton, dancehall, soca, and reggae. The dance club as a generative locus for Creolization deserves greater attention. While UNESCO fears the corrosive power of globalization, as Belizeans of diverse ethnic backgrounds gather in nightclubs to dance, play, and flirt, they participate in processes of Creolization that promote respect for cultural diversity and fortify regional communities, even as those communities are changing. First, let's take up Creolization theory and compare that to the rooted model of cultural heritage. We can begin with a 1989 essay on cultural identity and diaspora by Jamaican-British sociologist Stuart Hall. One of the most important contributions he made was to recognize that cultural identities are in every case contingent, the result of historical forces such as slavery, colonialism, class conflict, and global capitalism. As this relates to heritage, it implies that how people identify themselves and how they define their heritage are not foregone conclusions. Hall argued that while the rooted model of cultural identity has prevailed, it is largely irrelevant for Afro-Caribbean people who were violently uprooted and displaced to the Caribbean for the plantation economy. The rooted model would expect that Afro-Caribbeans just need to tap into their ancient African roots to recover their authentic cultural selves. Hall notes, however, that the connection to African cultural practices and identities was irreparably sundered by slavery and colonialism. Instead, he notes, Afro-Caribbeans very consciously identify as culturally hybrid, people who have been exposed to African, European, and indigenous cultural practices, and most importantly, people who have created and continue to create experimental blends from diverse sources. Significantly, though, these new cultural practices cannot be reduced to their sources, but through the processes of creolization, Afro-Caribbeans create new cultural realities. In his words, quote, "The diaspora experience is defined not by essence or purity, but by the recognition of a necessary heterogeneity and diversity, by a conception of identity which lives with and through, not despite difference, by hybridity." Hall drew upon Dick Hebdige, who concluded that the cut and mix style, or the syncretic dynamic which critically appropriates elements from the master codes of the dominant culture and creolizes them, end quote, is the, quote, "heart and soul of Black music." Then, in his 1995 essay, Creolization in the Making of the Americas, French Martinican writer Edouard Glissant reveals Hall's influence, and most critically, he considers the social context of cultural creolization. Affirming Hall's insight, Glissant writes, quote, "The concept of diversity is an immediate, real-life experience of Afro-Caribbeans, no longer a dream nor an aspiration, but for them a first-hand basic reality," end quote. Their cultural creolization, he said, quote, "is not an uprooting, a loss of sight. Diversity is not delusion, because creolization adds something new to the components that participate in it," end quote. According to Glissant, this creolization was in part the product of the oppressive plantation system in which African cultural practices were expressly forbidden. Within the plantation setting, people from diverse cultural backgrounds and languages were thrown together. The hybrid blends in culture and Creole languages that they created enabled them to forge new ties across difference. This is critical. In his words, quote, "By accomplishing a real integration, giving birth to a new dimension of being, they created another new dimension, that of opening ways," end quote. The cultural hybridity was, in other words, key to creating new communities despite the violent ruptures the enslaved people had experienced. This new identity, and, quote, "open and strong identity," is also a strong solidarity, he wrote. The openness of identity that Glissant celebrated is elaborated in his 1990 book, Poetics of Relation, in which he incorporated Félix Guattari and Gilles Deleuze's theory of the rhizome. While the familiar rooted plant, which stems from one central root, the rhizome extends its shoots horizontally outward in several directions. A rhizomatic identity reaches and spreads outwardly as it generates new plants. In a related vein, Glissant identified an archipelagic identity, said to be characteristic of the Caribbean archipelago. Archipelagic thinking entails a simultaneous imagination of belonging and relation. From a person's position on an island in an archipelago, they can look out and see the other islands. Archipelagic thinking is, in Glissant's words, quote, "the schema of belonging and relation at the same time," end quote. One feels a sense of belonging, of being rooted in a spot, while also feeling a sense of kinship to that other island. Archipelagic thinking is optimistic, imagining solidarity with others who also feel rooted in their own places. Archipelagic thinking offers the promise of new solidarities and new forms of cooperation. It is future-oriented. One can hardly imagine a place more in need of archipelagic thinking and cultural creolization than Belize. Although it is a tiny country with only 397,000 inhabitants as of 2022, it is home to extraordinary ethnic and linguistic diversity. When Belize gained independence from the United Kingdom in 1981, it was home to diverse groups of people who had been subjugated under colonial rule. They included a large population of people who called themselves Creole, or mixed race, descendants of the African slaves and their British enslavers, Garifuna people, descendants of escaped Maroons who had mixed with indigenous Caribs, 4 groups of indigenous people, Maya and Mosquito, East Indians and Chinese who had been brought in as indentured servants, Hispanic Yucatecans from the north who entered as war refugees, and Mennonites who were invited to settle to support domestic agriculture. In recent years, they have been joined by large numbers of immigrants from Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador. This table shows that more than 10 languages are spoken in this tiny country. These diverse people, in colonial and post-colonial settings, needed to create a hybrid cultural reality within which they could interact, work, trade, and relax and play together. They benefited from a self-consciously pluriethnic identity, proud of its diverse heritages and its abilities to see commonality across differences and to continually adjust and absorb newcomers. In Belize, the dance club is a central locale within which this cultural creolization takes place. On any given weekend night, young people pour into dance clubs, typically chatting with one another in Creole or Spanish and dancing to a potpourri of musical genres. The music played in the dance clubs most assuredly does not fit the UNESCO definition of cultural heritage. It uses electronic instrumentation, is recorded digitally, and is blared on electric speakers. It is self-consciously modern music, not claiming to have been passed down faithfully through the generations from within an ethnic group. Some of it is of Belizean origin, notably punta, often sung with Creole, Garifuna, English, or Spanish lyrics. The music played is of much broader regional scope, primarily from other Caribbean nations, such as reggaeton, originally from Puerto Rico and Panama, dancehall and reggae of Jamaican origin, and soca from Trinidad. Lyrics are variously in Belizean Creole, Jamaican Creole, Trinidadian Creole, Spanish, English, Garifuna, or some combination thereof. As a group, then, the music connects Belizean audiences and dancers with a circum-Caribbean community. Embodied experiences in the dance club create the lively, playful, and joyous atmosphere that sparks the poetics of relation. The dancers are packed together with barely enough room to gyrate hips. Outstretched hands can touch several people. Dance partners place their hands on one another's hips. The tropical heat is intense, and it is not long before one's hair and clothes are doused in sweat. The music blares so loudly that conversation happens only through yelling. People don't come to the dance club for lengthy conversations, after all. The club is simple in form, just a large open room with bars on one or two sides, with customers leaning and yelling over one another to place their orders, and staffed by bartenders who work in a frenzy to sate the thirst of their customers. Dancing continues until the early morning hours. Specifically, the Belizean punta dance, sometimes called punta rock, is iconic in the dance club. It is sexually suggestive as hips and buttocks shape variously and partners will rub up against one another. At the same time, though, punta is playful, so fast that dancers struggle to keep up and people laugh as they try to meet the challenge. Flirtations commence, romances are sparked, and probably new Belizean babies are born. The point is, in the dance club, music that ties the dancers to a circum-Caribbean community is the medium through which local, pluriethnic relationships are formed. To illustrate, this is a short clip of Belizean artist Super G's Muévelo music video. Muévelo means move it. You can see the sensuality, fast pace, playfulness, and joy of punta, the necessary ingredients of social connection and solidarity. To conclude, a useful approach to cultural heritage would start with people's cultural identities, how they see themselves, not how we expect them to be. While we might hope to see identification with ancient pre-colonial pasts, people in the present might privilege openness and an orientation to the future, and for good reasons tied to their specific histories. If they value practices that are translocal, self-consciously hybrid, experimental, and playful, let's listen carefully.